My name is Dean Greaves. I am Head of Relationship Management here at Wise. And we have two fantastic speakers lined up, but just a few housekeeping rules before we start, if I may. So you should be able to see some instructions on the slide there, but just to reinforce those, please use the questions function in the side panel of GoToWebinar to ask questions throughout the whole of the session. We'll answer those in Q&A at the end of that. And also, if your audio isn't working, you can change the computer audio settings to phone call, and it will it'll provide you, in fact, with a number for you to dial in. Please do stay muted, though, throughout the session to avoid any background noise. Thank you. We'd also like to ensure, as we do, all of our events and webinars are the best they can possibly be. So we'd be very grateful if you would complete a short feedback survey at the end. And if you do, as I say, it'll be very much appreciated. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome, I'm delighted to have him here actually, Mickey Nicholas from Northumbrian Water. Mickey joined Northumbrian Water as the I&D manager in 2020. He has brought with him a broad and varied experience from his diverse career background. Notably, he was the first non-white union exec for the Fire Brigades Union, a TUC Race Relations Committee member, worked with the Home Office and DCLG to bring changes to the National Fire Service recruitment and selection processes to encourage diversity. He was also elected as a Labour councillor in Newham, East London, 2004 to 2014, and also received an MBE for services to the Fire and Rescue Service and the London community in June 2017. Welcome to the webinar, Mickey.
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you, Mickey.
Oh, good. That's brilliant. For a minute, I thought I'd lost connection. So yeah, I'm absolutely passionate about leadership, especially when we start to talk about D&I and the responsibility that, however we define leadership, has in that particular space. So I'll start with the slides. When I talk about inclusive leadership, we often say why do we need that, and what I've found in many organizations, public sector and private, is that if D&I is important and inclusion is important, then the leadership of any organization make that a priority, and they have a strategy for that priority. So when we talk about leadership, we talk about what's our historical definition of leadership, and that normally means for many organizations the people at the top, or the people who've got a title. And I think that needs to be redefined in many organizations, because sometimes, more often not, leaders tend to be people who are really good people, and people who listen. Also, leadership has been redefined just because of the pandemic and the new world of work, as they call it. And it's really important that organizations take the opportunity, because of the opportunities afforded to us by the pandemic, to start to really look at what they mean by leadership as well. In terms of future leaders, I think what organizations really need to do around future leaders are people. Most of our leaders in organizations, in a very traditional way, are not necessarily people who are fantastic in terms of people skills, soft skills, listening skills as well. And I think the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic gives us an opportunity to do that. And most importantly, I think very quickly, if you've got the right people in place, that you see as leaders, and how you appoint and select those leaders, you'll see outcomes almost immediately when we start to talk about inclusion and a leadership that is inclusive as well. Next slide, please. And the next one. So inclusive decisions and some of the things that they involve. The first thing is the organisation. What is its values and what's the ethos of the organisation? And do all the leaders in that organisation understand that and buy into that, and ultimately are the best advocates of that as well? The inclusive decisions also depends on the culture of your organisation, and working really, really hard first and foremost to get some insight into what is the culture of your organisation. And sometimes that can have a real big impact on how quickly you move to being an inclusive organisation, or in terms of some of the work you have to do. When we talk about inclusion, very often align it with diversity for obvious reasons. If you're going to be inclusive, that means you need to have a really good representation of an inclusive society. So diversity is really, really important to that. And I've sort of, in my years of experience, seen that the public sector are a little bit ahead of the curve when we talk about diversity and what that really means, as opposed to the private sector. In terms of inclusivity, the most important thing about it is challenge, and how do we embrace challenge? Challenge can sometimes, for many organisations, be very, very difficult and can have a very negative connotation. And it's getting our leaders and our leadership of organisations to see that actually challenge is a good thing. Done in the right way and appropriately, challenge is what drives us. It leads to innovation, it leads to creativity, and it really, really is an important part of inclusion. And again, as I said in the last slide, the gains for having that kind of inclusive culture and inclusive drive in an organisation, the gains, again, for that ethos can be very, very quick in any organisation who truly embrace that. Next slide, please. So Northumbrian Water. So some of the things we've done around leadership and making sure that our leadership is a lot more inclusive than it currently is. And every day is a school day here. So first of all, we wanted to start to identify what we mean by leadership and who are our leaders. And it's very much an organisation that has a culture that the people who are at the top or the people who have a certain status are the leaders of the organisation. And some of the things we're trying to do here is to get the organisation within its culture, very traditional, conservative culture with a small c, is that leaders are everywhere in your business. So it's an identification of that and an awareness of that amongst those leaders in the first place. Alongside that, we've got now a management or a leaders, if you like, development program, because one of the things that's really, really important when we start to talk about people skills and how to be inclusive is how people learn to do that. And it's very much a learning process here. We brought in some programs, especially for our executive leaders, not only on a professional level, but also a personal level, to get them to more widely understand what leadership means and the type of leaders that the organisation needs to be as well. And when we talk about leading in a very traditional organisation that doesn't have a lot of diversity, and I would argue historically has not done too much around inclusion, is about what does leading mean and how do we become better leaders. And finally, the most important thing is to review and consistently monitor what we do around leadership. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I've looked at the time and I think that's enough for me. So obviously at the appropriate point, I'm more than happy to take some questions and have a discussion around some of the things I've highlighted there. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was great. Thank you very much, Mickey. What I'd like to do now, if I may, I'd like to welcome Senator Shankaran from Amazon, and Sang, as she's for short, is currently the head of developer engagement for Amazon Web Services in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Prior to this at Amazon, she led the professional services team for Amazon Business and the Subscribe and Save programme for the UK. Sang is an active member of the UK Women at Amazon board. She leads external partnerships for women at Amazon. She's passionate about fostering an inclusive team culture, a champion for diversity, and also an active mentor, a sponsor for talent in the organisation. Sang holds an undergraduate degree in computer science and engineering and an MBE from IST Business School, Barcelona. Welcome, Sangeeta.
No, thank you so much, Dean, for that introduction. And thank you, Mickey. I think a lot of what you said actually resonated with some of the things that we're doing here at Amazon and at Amazon Web Services, which is the part of the business that I belong to. Anyway, firstly, welcome everyone. I just wanted to say, I'd like to welcome you today, right? Whether it's your history, your political affiliation, your sexual orientation, your communication style, your opinions, everything is welcome here. And so today I'm here to talk about why I think, the power of inclusion, hopefully complementing some of the things that Mickey already spoke about, and what inclusive leadership means for Amazon Web Services as well as me. Next slide. So this is a quote from Jeff Bezos, which says it's not only that diversity and inclusion are good for our business, it's more fundamental than that. It's simply right. So these are some of our core values at AWS, and we are absolutely committed to having a diverse workforce, not just because it allows us to drive innovation for customers, right? Like the more diverse our employees are, the better we can design for our customers, but also because it's the right thing to do. We're also committed to developing our web services, which are actually help customers advance diversity, inclusion, and equity for their customers. Before we jump in, I'm actually going to do a really quick tour of like thank you, Hannah, what we mean by DEI at Amazon. It's it's a definition that we try and like create cohesion around. So at a very high level, we think about it as number one, diversity being a combination of unique skills, experiences, perspectives, cultural backgrounds, sexual orientation, etc., that make us who we are. So it's really about representation. When we talk about equity, it's really guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, advancement, and equity is really the act of identifying and eliminating barriers that actually prevent full participation of some groups. I'll spend a little more time on equity because I think, it's sometimes an important distinction. At least I had a bit of an aha moment when, I came to kind of recognize what equity versus equality meant. And finally, inclusion, I think, Mickey also pointed it out, saying inclusion is what makes diversity work, right? It's a state in which all individuals are just able to be themselves, right? All identities need to be valued. And I think that's how we think about inclusion as. Next slide. So equality has gotten us here today, right? But we need to really think about equity. And I'm going to use a bit of a real world example, right? Let's assume your office building has one door with stairs that everyone uses to get in and out, and no one's treated differently. That's equality. Everyone gets the exact same opportunity. But what works for some people actually might represent a barrier for others. So many people might actually require a ramp to enter a building. So someone who uses a wheelchair, someone who's 8.5 months pregnant, someone who needs to roll heavy equipment in and out. So it's not equal treatment for some people to use a ramp and others to use stairs, but it's the equity that's actually necessary for everyone to get to work. I did want you to want to leave with a bit of a thought here. So physical and systemic barriers are all around us, right? Like they're often masquerading as, yeah, the most common way, therefore must be right. But it's only when you start to recognize these that you will actually be able to build equity into systems and make products as well as processes that work better for more people. So yeah, just want to leave that with you saying equality is when everyone's given the same resources, but equity is when each person is given resources that are tailored to their needs. Next slide. So you've all read the research, right? That it's more diverse teams produce better products, better services, and ultimately more revenue for their organizations. Diversity is just good for business. But at the same time, it's futile to really invest in diversity without a culture of inclusion. So I think it's inclusion, in my opinion, that makes diversity work. And I want to really stress that, and I think Mickey may alluded to it as well because it's really important. Human diversity in any organization is a good thing, right? But that is just not enough. So to harness that power of diversity, organizations have to create a culture of inclusion. For maximum innovation, maximum performance, you need a diverse team to be operating in a culture of inclusion. Over time, a diverse team, of course, and led by an inclusive leader will outperform a homogeneous team, however well managed it may be. And I think I just wanted to leave that quote in there. So increasing diversity does not by itself increase, sorry, one sec. My slides are stuck. Apologies. Yeah, increasing diversity does not by itself increase effectiveness, but what matters is how the organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape the power structure. Next slide. So at AWS, at Amazon Web Services, right, we know that diversity plus inclusion is powerful. So we've actually taken a step further where our internal DEI practice is actually called ID&E, which is inclusion, diversity, and equity with inclusion first. Let me give you some data points that came out of a Deloitte study, just to give you a sense of what this actually means and why inclusion is so important. Next slide. So organizations with inclusive cultures are 2 times as likely to meet or exceed financial targets. So 2 times, right? Number 2, the next slide. They're 3 times as likely to be high performing. Next slide. 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile. The next slide. And finally, 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So you can really see that impact of magnifying things when you have a group of people that work in an inclusive culture. And that's why we've kind of taken a step to call it inclusion, diversity, and equity. Next slide. I wanted to spend a bit of time just like more personally, right? Of course, as an organization, but also personally, what I think inclusion looks like. First and foremost, it's really about seeking diverse perspectives. So, in a meeting, I make sure that we're actively seeking representation from everyone. Secondly, listening for understanding without defending. So I think it's sometimes hard not to judge, right? Immediately, you want to say, but I don't think so. But sometimes it's really important to take a step back and really listen for perspective. The third thing is acknowledging mistakes and apologizing for impact. Like as a leader, I think, we're vulnerable. Sometimes we all make mistakes. And I think it's important to kind of show that vulnerability and apologize when, you've not done the right thing. And so I think it's something that I take really seriously. The next thing is, I think, recognizing the contribution of others. So really making sure that, contribution, however small or big. So I kind of try and put in mechanisms into my own ways of working with my team, with a larger organization, that a good job well done is always recognized. Welcoming feedback always. So, this is done in the form of making sure that I sometimes have informal office hours or specifically say, hey, I'm looking for feedback on X and Y in our next meeting. So I'd love for you to kind of come with some sort of opinions on that. And then I think Mickey referred to it as like how the pandemic has changed, like how we think about work, right? So I think it's really important as a leader to like model flexible and non-standard like work-life strategies, right? Whether it's calling out someone who's like on a flexible work contract and actually like, making, still able to progress in the career. So really like setting role models, or, it's actually like recognizing that I have like, different days. And so some days I don't want to spend all my time inside my home. So sometimes I'm taking meetings outside on a walk, and making that okay and acceptable to say you sometimes just want to get out of the house and this is when it is, or saying I want to block my calendar for lunch because this is really important. So I think it's really about sending signals. And yeah, I think overall inclusion is just a mindset and a way of being. And that's really important to me. Next slide. Inclusion is an element of team culture, and I think we can measure it. So one of the things we do at AWS, we actually survey employees frequently, and we kind of understand the pulse on, do you feel valued? Do you feel trusted? And do you feel informed? So this data is made available to all managers. And managers, as soon as a manager you see a low inclusion score, there's suggestions from the system, but also we talk about it openly as a team sometimes, at least this is what we do, to say what's missing, why are people not feeling valued, why are they not feeling trusted. But it's kind of treated as a measurable outcome, which kind of makes it easier for us to act on. Next slide. Going to leave a few things that we've tried doing at AWS and we actively do. One is we have a lot of Amazon affinity groups. So for example, for the LGBTQIA community, Glamazon, we have warriors for military personnel, we have a Black employee network, and all these groups foster that sense of inclusion, offer programming, and actually very often they actually advise senior leaders on company-wide decisions. We've got about 90,000 Amazon employees which participate in at least one affinity group. The other one is inclusion ambassadors, who are evangelists for inclusion, who've raised their hands to learn best practices, speak up when they hear or see microaggressions, and help their leaders as well be more inclusive. And we're continually refreshing this. Next slide. So I know we've covered a lot of territory, and it's hopefully got you thinking, but I'd like to leave you with 3 questions about what you should be asking. So think about who's missing, whose feedback is missing here, who hasn't been invited to contribute, right? What doesn't the data show? Number 2, what barriers really prevent full inclusion? Whether it's in product, whether it's in people, so what are the real barriers? And finally, what would equity look like if we built for the full spectrum of customer or employee needs? Next slide. So finally, 4 things: measure diversity and inclusion, really sponsor others, right? Set up a formal sponsorship program, or at least as individual leaders, make sure you're consciously highlighting the work of others. Lastly, create opportunities, right? Sometimes your most powerful action is just to step aside and let someone else speak, let someone else be able to take the lead. And I think it's great that we've got like different companies, we've got like a number of companies here working with WISE. Remember that, share what's working, because we're all working uphill, right, again, against a long history of inequity. So it's legacy work. And I really want to point it out that, we're in it together as a human race. So really actively share. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Dean and Hannah, for having me here.
Sang, absolute pleasure having you here, actually, and thank you very much indeed for that. I'm sure there will be other people that have the same views as myself that I think has provided, along with Mickey's presentation as well, a lot of food for thought there. So I'm anticipating a number of questions, actually, and I said, hang on, Q. Any questions slide has appeared. Do we have any questions, Hannah?
Yeah, we do. If an organisation could take one action to improve workplace inclusion, what would you recommend?
Ooh, that's a good one, actually. Mickey, could I ask you that? Would that be okay?
Yeah, Sangeeta mentioned it in her slide. Start to measure it. Start to measure it. If there's one action you're going to take that gives you the most insight, is make sure that your data systems are available and up to speed, because that starts to measure it. Everything is about evidence and insight, and data gives you that. So if there's one action you're going to take, internally, is measure it.
100% aligned with Mickey. I think it was exactly what I was going to say as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, both. Hannah, any further questions?
Yeah, the next one is, how can organisations increase cultural sensitivity and understanding?
Ooh, who would like to take that one?
Yeah, so I could say that, I think it's a combination of course, having we have internal trainings to actually recognize that. But sometimes as a first step, you actually need to build that community, because a lot of feedback that we get actually on some of our trainings actually are driven by the community, because it's absolutely impossible to do that. Even if you put a specialist task force of 3 people who are going to do this, they're not going to be able to do that in isolation. So I think it's important to recognize that, make that an organizational movement, create momentum around it. For us, we get a lot of it from affinity groups. For example, my full-time job's not within the DEI organization. I work closely with them, but I'm also an active volunteer of Women at UK, which is specifically looking at how can we make Amazon and AWS a more inclusive place for women. Similarly, there's like, and these are, and to understand the microaggressions and the kind of treatment that different groups get, it's important to build communities on that, and then of course set up like the right kind of trainings, making sure that there's monitoring mechanisms to what Mickey mentioned, right? Like how do you measure that any actions that you're taking are actually making an impact? So cultural insensitives have to come from that bottom-up movement as well. So really understanding, combining like third-party research with actual focus groups, understanding what employees are going through and what is needed to make meaningful change in the organization.
Yeah, it's that bottom-up approach that's actually really key. So yeah, thank you very much, Sang, for that, and you, Mickey, too. Do we have any other questions, Hannah?
Yeah, we've got one final question. What can an organisation do to address unconscious bias?
Who would
Mickey,
like?
do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've started to do, I'm not a lover on a personal level, although I understand it professionally, about unconscious bias training. I think there are other ways, because training means so many things to different people. I think there are other ways that you can start to recognize that maybe your processes, especially when we talk about recruitment and dare I say development opportunities for colleagues, is maybe not as good as it could be, certainly not as inclusive as it is. One of the things I often say to businesses is to take a real honest look using the data that they've got in terms of who gets afforded the opportunities and why. And some of that is looking at the organisation itself. So I'm just about to do a session next week with one of my customer teams, and customer obviously as the water industry is really important, like to us as it is with Amazon. And I'm trying to say to those managers, look at yourself, look at your life, look at your personal preferences, and then look at your recruitment, and then look at who you hire in comparison to the type of candidates and applications we have. So that's a real basic way of starting to drop the seed of unconscious bias, or sadly in some cases pretty conscious. But for me, it's about getting buy-in into understanding what bias means, as opposed to sitting people down and talking about training it. Sometimes training it, especially in terms of the sensitivities around things like bias, I don't personally believe is the right way forward.
And just to add on to that, like I think it's not just that one training. So one of the things we started doing is, before a performance review, before you're writing feedback for a person, constantly reminding people of what unconscious bias looks like. So really making people think twice about, when you say this about a person, is that because you are not like that? Is that why you're saying this person's not that way? And so making that a really conscious part, like, when we recruit, saying, here's a reminder, right? Make sure that when you're recruiting, this is happening. Performance reviews, here's a reminder. Similarly, when we're doing like appraisals, when we're talking to individuals, really like making sure that, you're not exactly unconsciously letting these biases impact you. So I think it's also, incorporating that in like practical terms rather than it being a standalone training, just like Mickey said.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I actually can't thank both of you enough for this morning, because I think, and I'm sure the feedback from the audience or participants today will reflect that. I think what we've listened to today are two people talking very I can't even say it, very eloquently about things that they are both very passionate in. And I think what I've certainly come away with today is a lot of advice, and that has been wholly informative. So again, thank you both very much indeed for that.